This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, June 1953, Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott wed in the front yard of Scott's childhood home in rural Perry County, Alabama. I do love a yard wedding, and we will get into some of the details. This was the biggest one that the town had ever seen. Some 350 people were there. Lots of lovely details about the ceremony and some telling ones as well. For instance, Coretta had the vow to obey her husband removed from the ceremony, which, as you can imagine, there you go. Even in the early 50s, that was quite the unusual and telling move. So in this episode, let's get into the relationship between these two extraordinary people, though a relationship that feels, in some ways, like many other relationships, for good and bad and very complex. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
We will complexify it. We will talk about what this relationship meant for the two of them, both extraordinary people in their own right, and a remarkable marriage. Let's linger in the ceremony itself, though, for a second before we.
I love a yard wedding.
I do
my
love a yard
reception
wedding.
was in my parents' backyard. I feel like Father of the Bride has been my inspiration for a lot of
this
weddings.
was a front yard wedding, which is a little more rare, but
Yes.
There you go. Is that if you have a wedding on a front yard, is that basically an invitation for anyone to roll in?
I mean,
right there.
Evidently, because there's 350 people at their wedding.
And they only invited like 25.
Right, exactly.
Come on, it's a barbecue.
Yeah, there is something very open and community-facing about that idea of having a front yard wedding. I kind of love that. I've only been to backyard weddings, so I like the widening of my horizons.
I mean, I guess it depends on the configuration of your home, too. Like, if you're on land and everything is in the front, then I suppose that makes sense.
350 people there, folks from Atlanta who had kind of never really been to a town this small before. The Kings did have to, or the soon-to-be Kings, did have to stay at a friend's funeral home the night before because hotels had refused them entry, which is quite remarkable. And Dr. King's father, Reverend King Sr., performed the service. So it was really a family affair. There's a lovely picture of the two of them. Nice white tuxedo top there for Dr. King. Want to do a little bit on how they met? I mean, it was sort of interesting and, it wasn't exactly love at first sight. They kind of had to feel it out a little bit.
Because they didn't see one another at first.
True.
They actually met through friends, and their first contact was talking to one another over the phone. And so you can kind of read that as a couple who is coming together over ideas. The idea that they're like the way they're evaluating one another is how they sound and what they talk about. King would later write in his autobiography that he'd never forget that the first discussion they had was about the question of racial and economic justice and the question of peace. He says, after an hour, my mind was made up. I said, you have everything I ever wanted in a woman. We ought to get married someday.
I love that.
I love it for speak for King.
I know.
Anyway.
What kind of a first date, though? It's like, you know what? Let's talk about the state of the world. Not like, do you like pina coladas? But like, let's talk about politics. And, that to me, I think says a lot, though, about who they were as people when they came together. That they were, both students, that they had come to Boston really to expand their personal and professional careers. I think I knew this, or maybe I forgot that Coretta Scott was an opera singer that, she used to sing at some of the marches as well. But to know that she was there at the Boston Conservatory and pursuing higher education as a woman in the 1950s, as a Black woman in the North in the 1950s, is not common. And he was there at Boston University getting his PhD.
And she was the one of the two of them who was an activist at the time.
Yeah.
She had come to Boston because she was originally getting her education at Antioch College, where she wasn't able to do the training because they wouldn't let a Black teacher into white classrooms, so she had to switch. She was a member of the NAACP. She was part of the post-war peace movement. So she was somebody who was already out there involved in a variety of different types of activism, while King was still in seminary and still getting his theological training. And so when you think about that first conversation, it does feel in some ways guided by Coretta rather than by Martin in a lot of ways.
It's funny, I recently rewatched the Malcolm X movie. I think I mentioned that on the show a couple times. And the meeting between Malcolm and Betty is very, very similar to all of this. I mean, they're both very serious-minded. They mostly talk about kind of ideas in their work. She's a little more put together. She's, sussing him out as much as he's sussing her out. And then he immediately basically says, like, your wife material or whatever it is.
But it's funny that she's like, you not so much.
Well, yeah. So she seems more skeptical. I guess it was good that they were writing letters at first, because her main hang up seems to be height.
Yeah. It's 5'7". I've never thought of MLK as a tall person. I mean, I think that, obviously he looms large in our public imagination, but he's not a 6 foot, stunner. And the fact that she was like, he's 5'7", he's not that impressive. Like, she was not smitten when she first met him. But I think what is endearing and is sweet is that what compelled her to sort of stay in the relationship is that she felt like he was a kind person, that he was a good human being, that he thought about things deeply. Like, those things sort of stayed with her. And he was persistent, too.
Are you familiar with the phenomenon these days that I think the internet likes, talking about a short king?
Oh, yeah.
And here we are. The very first short king. Maybe this is the origin phrase. All right. So they get married. What is the sense of what kind of relationship they build, given them all we just said about how ambitious and accomplished both of them already were? What's the balance of power in that relationship?
Ooh, well, there's the personal and the political. I guess I'll start with the political side of things, because when we delve into the personal, I think we'll probably linger there for a while. But of course, as we were talking about, Coretta comes in with ideas and activism and things she wants to do in terms of her career and being part of this movement. And I think in some ways, her relationship with King was a window into a lot of that. She would later write about how, through the marriage, both of them had been thrust into the forefront of a movement to liberate oppressed people. And there was something really edifying about that. But she was also expected to be the one who had the children, stayed at home with the children, who was in some ways never really allowed to be fully a partner in the movement in the way that I think she had imagined and in the way that she had hoped. And I think King himself played a role in that, not only because of those kind of, patriarchal expectations that the woman stays at home and raises the children, but also just reading between the lines, maybe a little bit of competitiveness. He didn't want her to be too out front and would in fact belittle her sometimes in public as a way of kind of keeping her in her place. So there was an uneasiness about her public presence, I think, in the relationship.
Yeah, I think that given that they get married in 1953, within 2 years, they have their first child. And then subsequently after that, just about almost every 2 years, they're having children. They have 4 children together. But Coretta says, I love being your wife and the mother of your children. But she tells him, like, but if that's all I'm going to do, like, I'll go crazy. And I think that what we don't give Coretta enough credit for is that, like, she had a desire and an ability, which I think is equally important, to do this work, to not just sort of be the silent partner or the supportive wife who's, perfectly hair coiffed off in a corner. Like, she really wanted to be doing this work. And it's just unfortunate because I think about the civil rights movement and how much women were marginalized within that movement, or how much women were not allowed to have, a voice or a voice with volume. And it just makes me ask the question, like, how much more could have been accomplished, how much more could have been done or said had these women not been, benched or put on the sidelines.
And Coretta King points this out even while her husband is still alive. In 1965, she writes this piece for New Lady magazine where she argues that women have always been the backbone of the whole civil rights movement. And she's in a position to know because she has been working with women behind the scenes. She has been part of this movement and has seen a lot of the unsung labor that has been done by Black women within the movement in ways that just are much less visible than the kind of work her husband does.
The work and also just the sort of influence. I mean, she's largely now at least credited with helping shape a lot of his ideas, especially around the Vietnam War. She pushed him to be more assertive towards the end of his life around that. And, he does occasionally give her credit for helping him think through and be the main sounding board for a lot of his ideas. But yeah, that is silent, uncredited work and leaves that question of what could have been had these movements not been trapped in so many of the kind of backwards thinking about gender norms that they were. That said, I'm curious, is their relationship and the dynamic there more unique or just emblematic? I mean, is just this dynamic sort of up and down the list of politicians and activists throughout that era? I mean, even up to today.
I mean, when I think about the institution of marriage, I would not want to be married in the 50s and 60s. I mean, I think about not just how much patriarchy is sort of setting the tone for how people engage with one another, but this is also a period of just like rampant, unapologetic infidelity. And King is not alone in this. I mean, you think about JFK, you think about all of these political figures that, the game is, women accumulation and how many people they can sleep with or whatever. And so that was a part of King's legacy as well. And because of the way that respectability politics operated, people didn't talk about that. It was just something that you either quietly accepted or you beefed about, behind closed doors, but you didn't really put that out there into the public to discuss. But everyone knew that these things were taking place. And so because of that, for me, I always see their relationship somewhat of a partnership, but a partnership that just had the potential to be so much more had Coretta been allowed to thrive in the relationship.
What kind of things did you write growing up? Did you write diaries or love letters or melodramatic poetry about the fate of mankind? And could you ever imagine getting on stage and reading those things in front of strangers? I know that I've basically memory holed a lot of that stuff, and no thank you, I am not interested in that. But luckily, plenty of people are, and the result is our fellow Radiotopia show, the Mortified Podcast. It is back with new episodes celebrating the 20th anniversary of the stage show that inspired the podcast. There's more laughs, more teenage writings, more awkwardness. In fact, Mortified is hosting its first ever Tournament of Teen Angst, where participants like this person compete for the title of Most Mortified.
January 12th. I keep looking at Matt and he then stares at me. I wish he stared at me because he likes me, not because he knows I stare at him.
So go check it out, and congrats to Mortified, one of the OG Radiotopia podcasts, on this incredible milestone, 20 years of their live show. The podcast is really wonderful listening. Mortified, wherever you get your podcasts.
I was thinking about people like Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, or Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, both marriages in which there was a lot of infidelity, and in which the trade-off was that the woman got to have more of a platform, got to be a real political partner. And I think there is some of that in the King relationship. I don't want to suggest that Coretta Scott King was like locked away in the kitchen and never got a chance to like be an activist. And I do think that there are points where Martin Luther King Jr. does say, as you were saying, Jody, she was part of my political awakening. We walked down this road together. But it does seem like she could have had more, but the time period is such a shackle. Like when we were talking earlier about his eagerness to get married and her reticence, like, part of that might be about their individual dynamics, but part of that is, like, as a woman, what are you losing when you get married in the 1950s and 1960s, especially if you want a life beyond marriage and motherhood? And, I mean, there's...
And she said that. She said, like, he wanted a wife. And she was like, I wasn't rushing to get a husband. Like, because of those limitations. You know, it was a rare man back then that could empower and encourage his wife to, you know, work alongside him and not just behind him.
Towards the end of her life, she says, I'm not saying Martin was a saint. Nobody is perfect, but as far as I'm concerned, our marriage was a very good marriage, and it was like that all the way to the end. But she clearly also lived this life of compartmentalization and I think a regret for all the things she had to give up. I want to do two things as we close out here. And one is look at what we just discussed has done for MLK's legacy, and then we'll circle back and talk about Coretta's legacy as well in the public imagination. But on MLK, this is an interesting moment to be doing this episode because there is a new big biography of King that I think a lot of people are talking about. A lot of people are reading. A lot of people
just won the Pulitzer.
Yep, just won the Pulitzer. So Jonathan Eig, and it's called King: A Life. And, you know, roughly speaking, I've ordered it. I haven't gotten it or started reading it yet, but you know, there's been a lot of discourse about the book, but roughly speaking, I think there's been a lot of books about King, some of which are very hagiographic and really paint him as the sort of modern American saint, and then others that try and kind of dig up a little dirt. And it's ironically enough, you know, some of the dirt that the FBI tried to dig up on him was about infidelity, and that stuff was kind of true. But, you know, this, I think, tries to just paint a more complex picture, and that's, I think, largely speaking, why the book has been lauded, and it has a lot on Coretta as well and their relationship. But, you know, how much does an understanding of his infidelity and the sort of compromises that took place in their personal lives affect what this man means in both the public imagination and the way we kind of do history and keep returning to his story?
I mean, people are complicated. That's the short of it. I think that people are neither saints nor villains. And that's what makes, I think, this so sort of fraught, because you really can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You can't say, well, he cheated on his wife, so nothing else matters, you know? And at the same time, you also can't say, well, he gave a great speech and so nothing else matters. Like, you know, there has to be a way that we take in every aspect and sort of like use what is useful and reckon with what is not.
There's also a real political utility to seeing King in his multidimensional historical self, because there has been a tendency in the past to present King as a saint. And in doing so, it has basically made the argument that in order to be taken seriously and to be a legitimate agent of change, you too must be a saint. And if you've done anything outside of the lines, well, then your cause or your movement isn't just, isn't righteous. It gets used as a cudgel in the same way that civility gets used as a cudgel against rights movements. And so by offering a more complicated King, it's a way of saying the people who fight for liberation are often messy, and they don't have perfect lives, and they make bad decisions, and sometimes their tactics aren't great. And that's okay. Let's understand the change that came out of it, and let's figure out like what it would look like to model a better version of this. Like, let's, you know, cultivate women leaders and give them more of an option instead of kind of pushing them to the sidelines. Like, there's a lot to learn from it, as well as like a political project and just not demanding sainthood from historical figures.
Total sidebar, but I'm just curious, as two historians and two people who've written history books recently about that are sort of geared towards the public, how do you feel about, oh, here's another King biography? I mean, like, you know, Kellie, your new book has so many stories that no one's ever heard of. And is it like better to tell a story no one's ever heard of, or is it better to return to King for the 15th time, but add some complexity and some nuance and all that stuff? I mean,
I think both. I think you need both. I think you definitely need new stories. That's for sure. But people are inexhaustible. And I think there's a reason why Lincoln has like a whole library of biographies on him. I think that Eig's work is very good, but it shouldn't be the last book that's ever written about King. We could talk about King forever. And I don't think that there is nothing new or nothing not new to say, I should say. There are always different ways where we can sort of come back to a person and look at it differently, because culture changes all the time. And so the things that, would not have been shunned during his day, i.e. his treatment of his wife, we have a completely different outlook on that now. And so that requires reappraisal. And so I'm okay with that. I don't think there's ever a time where you could say too much necessarily about one person.
Yeah, totally co-sign on that. And as a peek into the market, it's also much easier to get a contract for someone that everyone's heard of than the person no one has heard of.
Yeah.
I remember my advisor was like, you want to sell a book? Put Lincoln in it. Put Lincoln in it.
Put a swastika on the cover, you're fine.
Right. So funnily enough, there's a great, I think, sort of nuanced in itself Washington Post review of this new Jonathan Eick biography of King. And it points out in there that actually the stuff about Coretta might be the most sort of interesting and nuanced, in part because Coretta, lived for a long time, talked a lot, gave a lot of interviews. And King, he wrote letters, he gave speeches, but he actually he didn't keep a diary. He wasn't super, getting to his interior life is a little harder. Whereas if you're interested in learning about Coretta's interior life, which hasn't been the case until relatively recently, there actually is a lot to mine there. So, as I said, let's end with looking at...
There should be a biography.
Yes.
Multiple biographies of Coretta is what we're trying to say.
And so where does that story sit right now compared to when she lived after his death and she was sort of championing his cause? What is our understanding of her now, and kind of how does it help us maybe do better history going forward?
Well, one of the things we see is a kind of flowering of her activism in the aftermath of MLK's assassination. So she is in part doing the work of legacy. So she works to create the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. She's part of the push to get the MLK holiday established. But she also just dives right into the work. She plays a big role in the Poor People's Campaign. She fights against apartheid. She opposes the war in Iraq. She's an activist, and she is sort of center stage as an activist after 1968.
Yeah, she really becomes, I think, the person that shapes so much of the King that we know, because she was so instrumental in, perpetuating even his birthday as a national holiday. That's all Coretta's work. Yeah. But I do think that sometimes in pushing those legacies and shaping those agendas, I think she as a person is often lost. I wish people knew how talented she was and what, gifts and abilities she could offer us. I wish that was put more front and center.
Yeah. As we often do when we end these episodes, we mention any plaques or memorials or sculptures. So the house that we mentioned where they got married and there's the front lawn, it's still there. It's located on Coretta Scott King Memorial Highway in Alabama. I think in the last year or two, the house is vacant and not open to visitors now. It hasn't been turned into a museum or anything, but it's still there and you can go visit that lawn. This is really just a segue for me to get to the sculpture. So, Kellie, I know you have thoughts. Tell us about the sculpture and tell us your thoughts.
I hate it. I hate it.
So what is it? Where is it? What does it look like?
So if you are traveling to Boston anytime soon this summer, perhaps you can go to the Boston Common and see a ginormous sculpture of what looks like entangled arms, I guess you could say. It is meant to capture the moment in which MLK won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he is embracing Coretta. And so the sculpture itself is called The Embrace. And so instead of putting, as they should have, the artist put their heads and their bodies and actually rendered the embrace, it is just like an amalgamation of arms and hands, and it looks very sexual depending on the angle that you are looking at.
But I totally agree with you. It's this feels sexual, but I can't really tell why, because it is just arms.
Not enough body parts.
Right, but it's
not enough body parts.
It's what's that internet meme? It's what's something that feels them but isn't? And it's this feels like I should be ashamed of it, but it's actually just two arms.
The fact that it is just someone I saw on Twitter talked about how that oftentimes oppressed people are seen as just laborers, and a shorthand for that is just hands, that they're just helping hands. That's what they do. They're workers. And so to encapsulate their love with just like arms and hands, to me, feels like it really shortchanges everything that they worked for and fought for. And to me, representation is such a big deal that to be able to see Black love in a display that is literal and not imaginative, I think is important. But I really do like the sculpture. Like his other work is great.
I respect the attempt, and I think that there is an argument for, in the same way that we said, there's so many books. Do we need another book? It's like, there's so many sculptures of MLK. Do we need another one that just shows him looking august? But, as the signature most public sculpture of Coretta and it not featuring her face, you're right. It is a little bit of like representation does matter, I suppose, in that sense. But I get what it's going for. It's provocative. We're talking about it. I'm sure people talk about it. So,
Sort of heart-shaped, too, a little bit.
Sure. A heart is the anatomical thing you're seeing there.
So we'll post a picture of it maybe in the newsletter and people can tell us what they think it is. And then I will say that the New England Conservatory, we talked about her music background, they have, in the last few years, have a bust of Coretta that's actually beautiful. And, they did it right with that one. So, you can do it. If you're in Boston, you can do a little dual visit there of the two.
Do both.
Of the two. Yeah. All right. Well, let's leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.